Thank you. It's good to see you, David. Thanks for agreeing to do this. I know you're a busy man.
Not that busy.
So this morning, you began the day, I began the day by drinking coffee. You began the day by speaking to Paul Ryan.
Yes, at the Economic Club of Washington, I'm the president of the Economic Club of Washington, and we had this morning Paul Ryan as our special guest, and it was interesting.
Well, so talk to us a little bit about, there's been a lot of discussion generally, but not specifically about the economy and what needs to be done by whoever is president next year. You spoke to a man who will be pivotal in passing any legislation. What do you think will happen with Paul Ryan, the House caucus, and the economy next year, and what should happen?
Well, there's no doubt that he will be the Speaker of the House. I think it's unlikely the Democrats are going to recapture the House. Hope springs eternal for the Democrats, but I think it's unlikely. So he will be the Speaker of the House. He doesn't know for certain who the President will be, and he doesn't know for certain who will control the Senate. But there are four issues that I think that have to deal with the economy that he is focused on. Number one is tax reform. We haven't had tax reform since 1986, and the tax code is a little complicated and many people think unfair. Secondly, trade. Assuming TPP is not approved, and he pretty much said today it wouldn't be approved in the lame duck, some kind of trade legislation or some type of way that we're going to have to deal with trade will have to be dealt with. Third is going to be immigration. We haven't really dealt with it for quite some time. And fourth is infrastructure. As all of you who live in Washington may know, there's a lot of crumbling infrastructure. And if anybody noticed potholes, so every time I see the mayor, I always say, you know, what about these potholes? But they don't seem to fix them. But a lot of potholes, and there's a lot of other problems in infrastructure, but not just in Washington, it's all around the country.
Yeah, I live in New York
problem.
City and deal with LaGuardia Airport, which is barely an airport.
Right, so it's a sad situation. So we have to repair the infrastructure of the country. I think Paul Ryan recognized that. I think most members of Congress would do. How we do it is the debate. Second, we have to get the tax code, I think, more equitable. Third, we're going to have to deal with trade, because assuming TPP isn't passed, we'll have to deal with the consequences of that. And I think immigration reform is long overdue. I think those are the four big issues.
Well, and I don't think most people would disagree with you. The question is, will they actually get tackled? I mean, Paul Ryan probably wants to run for president at some point, right?
Well, he didn't say that. I pointed out to him, not that he needed me to point it out, but that in 25 years from today, he would be running, if he ran, he'd be the same age as Donald Trump.
Right.
So he's got a long way to go. So I'd say so. He's 46.
But you think that a Republican, if Hillary Clinton is elected, which makes this question more interesting, that a House Republican caucus will work with the Democratic president on big issues like immigration and taxes before 2020?
I think it's likely there'll be some period of goodwill, but I do think, obviously, if a president is elected with a large mandate, wins by an overwhelming majority, it makes it easier for that president to get something done. If somebody is narrowly elected, it makes it harder. And of course, if the House is controlled by the Republicans and the Senate's controlled by the Republicans, it'd probably be more complicated for her if she's elected. But it's too early to say. I do think that the lame duck session of Congress, we have a lot of ambitions for that in Washington, D.C., but most likely, I don't think anything significant is going to happen except funding the budget of the country and the appropriation bills. That's all we're probably going to do. It's significant, but I think TPP is going to be complicated, and I don't expect anything great coming out of the lame duck.
Okay, so I'm going to count that as cautious optimism. I would like to talk to you about the big picture, though. You know, when we talk about America and the social compact and politics, people refer to you often as a patriotic philanthropist. And that's in part due to your big investments in things like the Washington Monument or the Magna Carta that you gifted basically to the U.S. public. Has your conception of patriotism been informed or changed in this election year?
Well, I wouldn't say the election year has changed. I think my concept is that all Americans have some obligation to give back to the country. And in my case, I got lucky in the business world, so I have the means to give back in different ways. But you can give back by your energy, your time, your ideas, anything you can do to give back to the country. It's a country that made everybody here presumably a better life than we might have had elsewhere. And you know, in my case, I came from modest circumstances, and I feel I should give back. I tried initially to give back by working in the White House for President Carter. I got inflation to 19%, among other things. And, you know, I have not been invited back into government since then, so I'm trying to atone for my sins by being a better citizen than maybe I was then.
Although sound economic policy doesn't necessarily act as a qualifier for elected office, as we're seeing from some of the candidates in the race. I digress. When But you touch upon something, which is the idea of giving back.
Right.
And that feels pretty endangered in American public life. I mean, I think the narrative right now is that American culture is very centered on me, and you have been focused on us.
Well, it's not just me. The Americans are the biggest philanthropists in the world. As a percentage of our GDP, we give a higher percentage than any other country in the world by a factor of 100%. We're twice as big as the next biggest country, percentage-wise. Americans have a tradition of this because our country started poor, and we have a tradition of funding from the private sector, universities and libraries and hospitals and so forth. However, there's no doubt that every citizen doesn't feel that they have an obligation to give back, and some don't have the means to do it. I think if you don't have the financial means, you could do it by volunteer work or other kinds of things. So I try to encourage people to try to give back to the country, learn more about the country's history. I have a theory, which isn't mine alone, that if people know more about their history, they might be more informed citizens. They were more informed citizens, we might have a better government in many ways. So I often say to myself, why is it that in 1776, we had only 3 million Americans when we revolted against the British. Of those, 500,000 were slaves, so they weren't involved in government. Then we had 1.25 million of those remaining 2.5 million who were women, and they weren't allowed to be in government. So out of 1.25 million white males, Christian white males, there were no Jews involved in government in those days that I could see, and there weren't very many Jews in the country, 1.25 million white Christian males, we produced George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, among others. And today we have 330 million Americans, and we have produced less. So where are these people? So now, I have a theory that all the great people today have gone into private equity. And
or journalism.
But no, I don't know why we haven't produced leaders that. Now, I realize in those days people criticized George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and so forth, and I'm just being facetious, but the truth is there's no doubt that the country, it seems to be less enamored with our potential leaders than maybe we would like to be, and so there's obviously something that is not right, and I hope that ultimately whoever's elected president can win over more people than that person probably won over in the election day.
Well, when you talk about the stats comparing 2016 to 1776, imagine if Black people or women or Jews were allowed into the government, how many more leaders we would have had back then, too.
Well, we certainly would have had a different government than we had.
But you bring up slavery, and there is something that you're involved in
Right.
that I want to talk about, which is, I think, captured the imagination
Right.
of a lot of people in Washington and around the country, which is the Museum of African American History. You've been involved in that. What drew you to that project?
Well, let me explain. And Lonnie Bunch was here earlier, and I can't possibly replicate what he said, but I want to just put it in my own words. Lonnie did an incredible job. He worked for 11 years. He raised $540 million. The museum is put together by the Smithsonian. Half the money came from the federal government, the taxpayers. Half the money came from the private sector. It was my feeling that, as a regent of the Smithsonian, I should certainly support it, but it's my feeling that over the last 400 years of history in the West, there are two events that are so cataclysmic and so tragic that we should mark them and make sure everybody knows about them. One was the Holocaust,
Right.
and there is a museum for the Holocaust, and the other is slavery. And it's hard to believe that slaves were first imported in this country relatively by happenstance. Actually, it was really, the first blacks that came over were really actually indentured servants, but eventually, because of cotton and other things, we needed a lot of slaves, or they felt they needed slaves, I should say. We actually imported about 800,000 slaves over the years, but at the time of the Civil War, they had grown to 4 million slaves. 20 million people were stolen from Africa and brought to the Western world, most of them in Latin America and Central America, about 800,000 here. And not only were they brought over and the families were disrupted, but when cotton became such an important part of the Southern economy, slaves, about 1 million, were forced marched into the Deep South, very few of whom actually survived. And it was an incredible sense that people who were humans were owned as chattel.
Right.
And the great birth defect of our country was that we didn't deal with this at the beginning of the country. So when the country started, we didn't, in all men are created equal, didn't really mean all white and black men, let alone women, were created equal. And secondly, when we had the Constitutional Convention, of course, blacks were treated as 3/5 of a human, and they weren't really given any rights. And even after the Civil War, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were adopted, we still went into Jim Crow laws. So it's a tragic situation. This museum goes through the history of the African Americans in their country, but not only that, it goes through the culture and their achievements in so many other areas. So I think it's a life-changing experience for you to tour it, and anybody that hasn't had a chance to do it should do it, because whether you're black or white or whatever color you are, you will see the history of our country. And what I want to tell people is, it's not an African American museum, it's an American museum. It's for all Americans. And I really think it's a great credit is due to Lonnie Bunch and the other people who put this together.
Do you think we're getting, so this museum opens against the backdrop of Tulsa and Charlotte.
Right.
Do you feel like we as Americans are getting better at reconciling our past? And I specifically mean on race and slavery.
I think we recognize the sins of the past more than we used to, and I think we recognize where the goals should be, but I think getting there is challenging. And you have to ask yourself, there seem to be so many shootings that are occurring now of people that you would say maybe they shouldn't have been treated that way. Is this more common than before, or do we just have videos that now identify everything, whereas 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago...
What's your thinking on that?
Probably the videos are probably showing things that happened before, but we now have everything is on tape. But it's sad that today we're still living through this, and today, in the era where you would have the first African-American president, you would think that we would be able to be in a better situation. President Obama has done as much as anybody humanly can to do this, but I think he would say that we still have a lot to do, and I know he's going to try to do things after he leaves the White House, I suspect, to try to make this better as well.
Do you obviously are a student of history, you're interested in the artifacts of history,
Right.
You've invested in a lot of public spaces that are important to U.S. history. Do you think at all, though, there is the danger of sort of establishing a trend where individuals fill in where government pulls back, and that sort of normalizes private investment in public spaces in a way that gets, the government off the hook and public...
Well, there's always that downside. So Congress would say, well, if some people will put up the money for it, why should the government do it? It's always complicated, and I'd say we have a history of this. I'm not sure that I'm doing anything that's different that's been done before, and a lot of other people are doing what I'm doing. The most important thing I want to remind people about in these monuments and memorials is this. Today, you can go online and see everything. You can sit in your room and see all the things that are in the monuments and the memorials. Why is it so important to have these monuments and memorials? The answer is that the human has not yet advanced to the point where seeing something on a screen has the same effect as seeing it in person. So if you see the original Magna Carta, you see the original Declaration of Independence, you actually go to the Washington Monument, you might think about these kinds of things and the history and maybe be propelled to read more about it. And if you read more about it, I think it would be much better. Now, we have a literacy problem in our country as well. It's hard to believe that roughly 14% of the people in this country are functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the third grade level. And that is getting worse and worse. And if you can't read, you have a better chance of going in the criminal justice system. 85% of all juvenile delinquents are illiterate, and 2/3 of all the people in our prisons are illiterate. So if we don't do a better job of educating people and dealing with illiteracy, all the efforts of building monuments and memorials aren't going to affect everybody in the country. It'll affect some people who go visit them, and some people are just not going to be propelled to go visit these things.
Right, the discrepancies in society and sort of the factors that lead to them. I have to ask you, because we're talking about monuments and memorials, the Washington Monument, which is basically still standing in part because of you, is closed indefinitely because of some mysterious elevator problem. Does it occasionally feel like you're in the movie The Money Pit, and instead of a house, it's the Washington Monument? You're like, when does it end with this building?
The elevator is over 100 years old.
Sure.
And so it needs some assistance. And
is it going to open back up anytime soon?
I don't want to speak for the National Park Service, but I would say that they're working on it, and if I can be helpful, I will be. I think that it needs some assistance, but it's a great, it's 555.5 feet, and the reason it's that high is that the ancient Egyptians realized when obelisks were more than 10 times the size of the base, they fell over. So it's 55 feet, it's 555.5 feet up, and it was. It took a long time to build. A typical Washington project, it took about 100 years because they ran out of money and so forth. It complicated, but it started in the 1840s and didn't finish until about the 1880s or so.
And hopefully sometime in
this
millennium,
it'll be fixed
open
this
and
millennium, hopefully this year.
And we'll have you to thank. David Rubenstein,
How about
it's great
that?
to talk
Thank you.
to you. Thanks
Thank
for your
you.
time.